Hi folks, this is Mr. Oleson. This is AP Macro Unit 4, the financial sector. The topic of this video is the loanable funds market. The loanable funds market is a key graph that represents the amount of funds that are available to loan in the economy, and it brings together borrowers and lenders. Okay, the loanable fund market is going to set the real interest rate, not the nominal interest rate, but the real interest rate. So let's talk a little bit about the real interest rate. If the real interest rate was 50%, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, like most things in economics, the answer to that depends who you are. A 50% real interest rate would be really, really bad for borrowers because it would be a very expensive cost to borrowing money. On the other hand, loaners would love that because they would get a really high return on the loan that they're providing. Okay. When we look at the loanable funds market, it's going to show the supply and demand of loans and show the equilibrium real interest rate. Okay. This is a regular functioning market where thousands and thousands and even millions of people are coming together. So it's going to be good old-fashioned supply and demand. The law of demand is going to hold where there's an inverse relationship between the real interest rate and the quantity of loans demanded. When the real interest rate is really, really, really high, borrowers do not want to take out that many loans because they're expensive. On the other hand, when the interest rate is really, really low, then borrowers want to take out more loans because the money is relatively cheap. The old-fashioned law of supply applies here. There's a direct relationship between the real interest rate and the quantity of loan supply. If the real interest rate is really, really low, lenders are not that interested in supplying that many loans because they're not going to earn that much return on it. On the other hand, if the interest rate is really, really high, then lenders want to increase the quantity of loans because they're earning such a high rate of return on lending their money. Okay, the loanable funds market is not the same as the money market graph. Okay, in the money market graph, the supply of money is vertical, and that's because it's a policy graph and the supply of money is set by the Federal Reserve or the central bank. That's different than the loanable funds market. The loanable funds market has a regular upward sloping supply curve because it's a functioning market with thousands of people making that decision as self-interested rational actors as opposed to it being set by the central bank. So let's go ahead and draw the loanable funds market. Okay, we're going to put the real interest rate on the vertical and the quantity of loans on the horizontal. Because this is a functioning market where self-interested rational actors are making decisions for the long run, they are trying to take into account expected inflation. So therefore, we're going to analyze the real interest rate, which takes into account inflation. Okay, so what do we have? We have a downward sloping demand, and the demand for loans is the demand by borrowers or investors who are looking to borrow money to invest in their business, or borrow money. You all may be participating in this when you go off to college next year because you have a demand for loans to take out student loans for college. Okay. And then there's an upward sloping supply. Those who supply the loanable funds in this market are lenders, and that includes people who are saving their money. So if you have money in savings accounts, you are looking to loan that out to earn interest on it. So it's a regular upward sloping supply curve. Just like any good old-fashioned market where the supply and demand come together is going to set our equilibrium quantity of loans and our equilibrium real interest rate. So let's talk a little bit more about what's behind the supply curve. The supply of loanable funds is set by savers. Okay, and the reason that there's a supply of loanable funds is because people in the economy have money saved and they want to loan that out to other people to get a rate of return. There are a couple different groups of people that save money to earn interest. The first is private savings, so households in the economy save a certain percentage of their income as opposed to using it to consume, and that's going to provide this private savings by households. There's also a public savings, and that's how much money the government saves instead of spends, and they're going to look for a rate of return on that as well. So there's private savings, there's public savings, and if you add those together, you get the total national savings. Okay, obviously in the U.S., because our government deficit spends, we don't have public savings, right? We have the opposite of that. We have a negative public savings because the government's borrowing so much money, right? But in theory, the government can have public savings as well. In California, for example, until the COVID-19 crisis, the government was running a surplus. So that means they have extra tax revenue in compared to their spending, and then that's going to create some savings for them that they want to try to earn a return on. Okay. Whenever there's a change in public or private savings behavior, that's going to shift our loanable funds supply. So just like in any market, once we set an initial equilibrium, the supply curve can increase to the right or decrease to the left. So let's look at an example of that. Let's look at a situation that's probably happening due to COVID-19 and government increase in government spending. At the federal level, there's a $2.2 trillion stimulus that was just passed. So the government's going to increase deficit spending. Okay, what that's going to do is if the government increases deficit spending, that's going to decrease the amount of public savings because the government is saving less than they would have before or borrowing even more than they would have before. So that's going to impact the supply of loanable funds. It's going to decrease the supply of loanable funds, and when we decrease the supply of loanable funds, that raises the real interest rate and decreases the quantity of loans. Okay, this is something that comes up a lot in FRQs. It's called crowding out, it shows a negative impact of deficit spending on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right? The reason the government would deficit spend would be to increase aggregate demand, and yet because public savings decreases as a result of it, the real interest rate increases, which is going to lower investment spending, which puts downward pressure on aggregate demand. So this is how you would graph that idea of crowding out. Okay, it's not just domestic governments and households that can contribute to savings to the loanable funds market. It's also foreigners. So people in different countries can inject their savings into U.S. banks. Okay, so a couple terms that will come up related to that. There's a capital inflow. That's the amount of money entering the country to earn a return as savers in the loanable funds market. And there's also capital outflow. So Americans can take their money and they can go put their money in Japanese banks or Chinese banks or European banks and try to earn a rate of return there. Okay, something called the net capital outflow is when you take the capital inflow, so how much money is coming in from other countries, and you subtract the capital outflow, which is how much Americans are sending their money abroad, and you're going to get a net capital inflow. When that net capital inflow changes, you could also have a shift in the supply of loanable funds. So if foreigners get worried about COVID-19 in the U.S., they may decrease the amount of capital inflow because they want to keep their money at home, and that would decrease the net capital inflow, and that would decrease the supply of loanable funds. Let's talk in some more detail about the demand side. The demand side of the loanable funds market is investors, and they want to borrow money because they want to invest in new capital equipment and grow their businesses. Okay, so there's private investment, and that's borrowing done by businesses and consumers. So you may participate in the loanable funds market as a demander next year if you take out student loans for college. And when businesses take out loans to build a new factory, that's also part of private investment. There's also government borrowing, sometimes called public investment, and that's when the government deficit spends, and that's going to contribute on the demand side as well. Okay, a change that affects borrowing will shift the demand of loanable funds. So if you get an indication that private households or the government want to borrow more, that's going to increase demand to the right. And if you get an indication that borrowers want to borrow less, then that's going to decrease demand to the left. One common example that comes up on the exam a lot is investment tax credits. So one of the policies governments can implement is they can give you a tax credit if you investment spend, which means you have a more incentive to borrow money to grow your business. Okay, and when the government adds investment tax credits, that's going to decrease the demand for loanable funds. So this slide shows the demand and supply shifters. It could be a good reference for you as you're doing the practice problems, although this is not something you need to memorize once you get the hang of loanable funds graph. So what are things that are going to shift the demand for loanable funds? Basically, anytime you see changes in the behavior of borrowers. There are three groups of people in society who are going to borrow money in the loanable funds market: consumers, businesses, and governments. So if you get an indication that one of those three groups is going to borrow more, the demand curve will increase to the right. And if you get an indication that one of those groups are going to borrow less, the demand curve will decrease to the left. Okay. What about supply shifters? Anytime you see changes in the savings behavior of three different groups, the supply curve is going to shift. Private households save money, public governments can save money, and foreigners can move their money into a country to save money. So if you get indication that private households, the public, or foreigners want to save more, then you're going to get a supply increase to the right. And if you get an indication that they're going to want to save less in that particular country, you're going to get a decrease to the left. Okay. And just as by way of reminder, the thing that's going to help you solve these problems really easily is to always remind yourself the demand for loans is by borrowers, including business investors, and the supply of loans is from savers and people who are willing to loan out their money. Okay. And if you remember that, most folks are going to be able to do pretty well on these questions. Let's look at another example. This one's based on political instability. So make a prediction. What do you think is going to happen in the loanable funds market if there's political instability in a country and people are worried about chaos or civil war or political strife? Well, in this case, both demand and supply are going to shift. Okay. On the demand side, consumers are going to get concerned about what's going to happen. Businesses are going to get worried and not want to invest more to grow their businesses. So you're going to see a decrease in the demand for loanable funds. You're also going to see a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. Foreigners especially are going to worry and they're going to want to take their money out of that country. So in that initial supply curve, there was some amount of foreign capital, which is money sitting in banks looking to earn a rate of return. And now with this political instability, Japanese people or Chinese people or European people who have their money sitting in these banks in this particular country are going to say, we're worried about this political instability. We're going to move it out of it. And that's something called capital flight. So how would you express this on the graph? Well, you'd show a decrease in the demand to the left, and then you'd also show a decrease of supply to the left. Hopefully you recall that that would make the interest rate indeterminate, but we would definitely know that the quantity of loans issued in this particular country would fall. So this is a really important slide. A lot of students get confused between the money market graph and the loanable funds graph. So if you can answer these 10 questions, you're doing really well in differentiating what these graphs mean and what purposes they serve in economics. So pause the video, see if you can answer these 10 questions, then we'll go over them together. Number one, why is the supply of money vertical? That's because it's set by the central bank, so it's going to be independent of the interest rate. And because it's set by one institution, it's going to be vertical at a certain quantity. Number two, what shifts the supply of money? Monetary policy shifts the supply of money. There are three tools the Federal Reserve has to change the supply of money. They can change the required reserve ratio, they can change the discount rate, or they can do open market operations, which is the buying and selling of bonds. Number three, why is the supply of loanable funds upward sloping? Because this is a regular market where the law of supply holds, and you have thousands and thousands of self-interested rational actors who are deciding how much of their money they want to loan out for a rate of return. And when the interest rate is really, really low, they're not that interested in loaning that much money, so the quantity supplied is low, whereas when the interest rate is really, really high, the quantity of loanable funds supply is high. Number four, what shifts the supply of loanable funds? Changes in savings behavior of either households, businesses, or foreigners. If they want to save more, the curve will increase to the right. If they want to save less, the curve will decrease to the left. Number five, why is the demand for money downward sloping? The demand for money is downward sloping because the opportunity cost of holding money in your checking account or in cash is the interest you could be earning in other types of assets. So it's a downward sloping curve. Number 6, what shifts the demand for money? There are 3 shifters for the demand for money: changes in the price level, changes in income, or changes in technology like credit cards or ATM machines. Number 7, the demand for loanable funds is downward sloping because borrowers want to take out more loans when the interest rate is low, whereas they want to take out fewer loans when the interest rate is high because they're the ones who are paying the interest rate. Number 8, what shifts the demand for loanable funds? Anytime you have changes in the behavior of borrowers. So consumers and businesses and governments are going to borrow money in society. So when you have changes in that borrowing behavior, it's going to shift your loanable funds demand curve. Number 9, what kind of interest rate is on the money market graph? It's the nominal interest rate. And the reason is because it's a short-term policy-making graph that's not going to take into account inflation because it's what the Federal Reserve is doing in the short term. So it's just the nominal immediate interest rate. Number 10, what kind of interest rate is on the loanable funds graph? It's the real interest rate, and it's the real interest rate because it's self-interested rational actors who are accounting for inflation. They're thinking about what's going to happen to inflation over the long term, so it's going to take into account inflation, and therefore it's going to show us the real interest rate. This is an excellent practice FRQ. It's 2010 FRQ number 1, and it connects the ASAD model to the loanable funds graph and is an excellent example of tying a bunch of concepts together. So take a stab at it and then we'll go over the answers together. So this question starts off in long run equilibrium for part A. So you're going to have your short run equilibrium along the LARS. And then for part B, the disruption is an increase in government spending. And because government spending is a component of aggregate demand is going to increase to the right. And we're going to have a new short run equilibrium to the right of LARS. And unemployment rate's going to fall as a result of that. We've moved into an inflationary gap. So unemployment is really, really low. GDP is up. Unemployment is below the natural rate of unemployment. If this were the US, this would be, say, a 2% unemployment rate. Okay. Part C asks about the long run adjustment. So in the long run, what's eventually going to happen? And the key for the long run in macroeconomics is that wages and resource prices are going to adjust. So eventually in the long run, because we're in this inflationary gap and the price level's high, eventually because that general price level's high, wages are going to increase too. And when wages increase, the SARS is going to decrease to the left because businesses need to pay their workers more. So that decrease in the short run aggregate supply curve to the left brings us back to a new long run equilibrium along the LARS again. We're back to where we started. The economy has quote unquote fixed itself in the long run, and the price level is higher. So we've jumped up to PL2 here. Part D is really important because it has us move to the loanable funds market. Because the government, in order to increase that spending, the government financed it by borrowing money, by deficit spending. So we had a change in the borrowing behavior of the government. So we saw an increase in the demand for loanable funds, which increased the real interest rate. Okay, and this is a really important concept because it illustrates crowding out. So this is what we mean by crowding out. The government increased government spending, and the whole goal of that would be to increase aggregate demand. And yet, as a result of that, they had to come to the loanable funds market to increase the demand and borrow more money, which increased the real interest rate. And this is where we see the impact of that on Part E. Part E shows crowding out because as the real interest rate went up, there's a decrease of investment spending. And when there's a decrease in investment spending, we're going to have a decrease in capital formation, which leads to a reduction of economic growth. So the government came in there earlier in the question and crowded out private investment spending and crowded out real long-term growth because a negative secondary impact of them borrowing money was it increased the real interest rate, which decreased investment. Okay. So this is a classic example of crowding out, and it comes up a lot on the exam. This graph shows crowding out illustrated by an increase in the demand for loanable funds Other keys out there sometimes will show it by a decrease in the supply of loanable funds. You can actually draw it either way, whichever way makes more sense to you. But the result is, no doubt about it, when the government deficit spends, it's going to increase the real interest rate, which is going to decrease investment, which is by definition crowding out. All right, folks, that's topic 4.7, the loanable funds market. Thanks for paying attention. Enjoy the rest of your day.